Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. This is Dylan in the host chair once again. I've got a few fine fellows joining me for another Sunday evening of seeing what kind of damage we can do to our understanding of time and space. I've got, in no particular order, I've got Evan Buck.
Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
I've got Robert Koshu joining us, as long as he survives winter weather that we're all dealing with. And Chris, you have some fine words to say?
Hi, good people.
There we go. Okay.
Now it's an episode.
So this is a continuation of an episode that we did previously where we created an American monarchy. So just to bring everybody up to speed, in case you don't remember the last episode, 1786, you've got some of the stronger proponents of federalism, strong central government, specifically Nathaniel Gorham, who is the president of the Continental Congress, Alexander Hamilton, who has a very famous rap musical that probably will not exist in this timeline, named after him. And Monroe send a letter to a famous brother of a famous king, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who basically created the foundation of the sort of proto-German empire in Prussia, very militaristic, very tight. All your soldiers are 6'3" and up. That's a whole fun side story we can get into. He has a brother named Henry, who is basically sort of Voltaire's ideal philosopher king, and also has nothing else to do with his time. So they invite him, in real life, they sent a letter to Henry saying, hey, what would you think about an American monarchy? The real timeline, that didn't happen. In our timeline, Henry says, great, I've already tried to become king like 4 different times. Maybe this is the chance. He shows up. The Continental Congress in 1787 is like, well, crap, we can't tell him to go away. We just barely fought off the British. Now we've got the Prussians who might be on us. We've got no friends in the world. Okay, we got to let him be king. And just to give a quick recap, we decided that this is probably still kind of a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate, or House of Commons, House of Lords, whatever we want to call it. We're not worrying about the names really. The judiciary is going to be mostly the same, maybe with the king as kind of the final arbiter over the Supreme Court if they really want to appeal a final decision. But in terms of the foreign policy and the executive branch, we decided that, much like how the president in our structure has authority over treaties and foreign relations, that would be the purview of the king. And in state, affairs, local internal affairs would be sort of left to, a chancellor, Lord of the Exchequer, whatever you want to call it. We'll probably just use chancellor or something for this discussion. But basically, what we understand as our president would be sort of the minister of state, whereas the king would be the chief executive and in charge of foreign policy. Now, that gets us to right around the year 1800, when Henry, the now first king of America, dies in 1802 with no children. Now, to set the stage for sort of where this new royal America is at, this is 1802. Things are happening. France, probably most obviously, has been having a whole lot of fun ever since the early 1790s. So I want to start off this discussion with sort of what does America's involvement in a sort of very famous little tussle called the French Revolution end up looking like? And I'm going to throw it to the guys because I know we talked a little bit sort of about where this starts us, but I want to see where we're at.
So I think the first, it's kind of important to understand this is not our America. This is not an America that looks anything like anything we can imagine, especially because when you hear about, at least to a lot of us, when we hear France and Germany are at war, Britain somewhere in there, we think, okay, now the United States is going to start a draft, get a couple 100,000 people under arms and start shipping them over to fight either in France or invade France or something. That is nowhere near what's going to happen. There is no standing army or a very small one. I think if we do have some Prussianism some more Prussian influences in the United States. Maybe it's a little more serious, but it's nowhere near the point of actually like boots on European soil. I think it's important to kind of think about what happened in 1812, in our 1812, which isn't very far off, where we let you come and take it. I see my Texan smiling. Where we don't necessarily have the kind of force to project power into somebody else's realm. We can't land troops in Europe. I mean, even in 1812, we actually did invade Canada, and it went horribly.
And keep in mind, Britain was in our timeline, like basically blockading us starting in 1807.
Yep.
But the United States can fight on its own soil. If you have Americans fighting in America or American-like environs, fighting small-scale warfare, that's where we excel. And I think that's a lot of what we're going to see if you have if you have the Americans getting involved in a European war. It's going to look a lot like what we did in the French and Indian War.
Yeah, so we think it's, maybe some supplies and material, maybe some, to use a modern term, foreign advisors going over to mostly coordinate the American side of the effort rather than really being militarily involved. And we're basically going to do what we do best, which is muck around in the backwoods like a bunch of rednecks.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing. I think the main divergence, or one of the major divergences, which we talked about a little bit before we hopped on air here, was how there is not going to be a certain very famous individual making a certain very big pronouncement, individual by the name of General George Washington, who he basically elucidated this doctrine of, hey, stay out of foreign affairs, stay out of foreign conflicts and foreign wars. And then that kind of indirectly leads to the Monroe Doctrine a few years later. We don't have any of that in this timeline. We are basically going to be doing pretty much exactly the opposite. Now, to what degree that is, in the early 1800s, when we still don't have a great standing army and everything along those lines, is anybody's guess. But it's basically a complete seismic shift. It's a paradigm shift, really, in terms of how our early years as a nation were primarily focused, in our timeline, primarily focused on keeping Europe out, us expanding, the seeds of manifest destiny being sown essentially very early on. Our focus is going to be across the Atlantic a lot more than it was in our timeline.
So, go ahead, Robert.
With the one exception of, I do think if we're here and we had the Prussian influence and you've got the Franco-Prussian War kind of kicking off and bouncing around at this point, do we start looking over, like we talked about, do we start looking on the other side of the Appalachians and then on the other side of the Mississippi River and going, yeah, we're not paying for none of this. It's all attached. We're going to get it. And by the way, I am going to assume if we end up with a king, we end up with some sort of a landed gentry. And what better way to give the landed gentry land than to take a bunch of it from France and give it to them at the end of the day? Yeah. And then we don't have to give up anybody that anything paid for here in America. This is all free land. Baron von New York gets, his 2,000 acres and –
yeah, it's like that scene in The Patriot where they're like, tell me about Ohio.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And this is kind of the perfect time to do that because the 1790s, this is right before we historically acquired a lot of this stuff anyway. The Louisiana Purchase was right after the 1800s. Jackson, basically gallivanted around in Florida in the early 1800s. So it's not too far out of the weeds to believe that, especially with a king like Henry, who did very much have military experience, aspirations, like we talked about in the last podcast, he tried to be king of Poland. He tried to sweet talk Catherine the Great of Russia into creating this sort of, kingdom in sort of modern day Romania for him. He's going to want to try and live up to his brother and sort of, create some sort of legacy for himself. So I think it's very believable that at least we get sort of to the immediate Trans-Mississippi, even though we don't get to sort of full West Lewis and Clark, Louisiana territory. Unfortunately, that means no Sacagawea silver dollars in the 2000s, but hey, we'll survive.
I think we do. I think the United States takes all, because just to be very clear, one of the things we did talk about, France and Spain. There's in our timeline, there's a little bit of back and forth as to who owns what out there. But the fun thing is, both of them are on the same side of the early wars of the French Revolution, which means Henry II brings us into those. Basically, the War of the First Coalition. We're going after both Spain and Louisiana, and when we take Louisiana being the Louisiana Purchase areas. Mm-hmm. I think they just give up their claims, because if you look at, what we purchased when we bought Louisiana, I mean, we didn't know what Oregon was. We didn't know what any of it was. We just bought. The best way to think of it is almost like we bought crypto.
We basically bought the rights to go and take over that area.
Yeah,
we didn't really actually formally.
We bought like an NFT of Seattle, and we
Governor
didn't know.
Bankman freed him from Louisiana territory.
And the other thing is, and I didn't think of this, Christy did it, and I put the timeline together. There's another part of Spain that's attached still.
Yes, very much.
My Coahuila, La Texas is very much still Spain, and where Florida was easy, and we've got this, just cross the Sabine and let's go grab that while we're at it.
I don't know that we're going that.
I don't know that we're going there yet.
That's quick. That's a lot. That's quick. But yes.
Yeah, I think Texas is coming. I don't know if part of me is kind of, this is getting to be, depending on how much territory we acquire, we're getting dangerously close to a man's reach outseeds his grasp kind of situation. So, I do think Texas is something to consider when it comes in. I think it may come in earlier than 1836. Yeah, I think it comes in earlier.
And it had we had a big German immigration in the 1840s anyway into Texas through Indianola, settled up in New Braunfels, the hill country area. I think with this setup, we end up with a much, much larger Prussian-German presence.
Yes, I think that's very much the case, and I think that's going to be something to deal with once we get a few decades later, once we get into the questions of nationalism in the mid-1850s. But for right now, we just say, I guess, to kind of do a quick, summation of what we've got so far, so we acquire basically in the chaos of the War of the First Coalition, we basically take the most of the Louisiana Purchase, as we understand it, Spanish Florida. Do we take anything in the Caribbean at this point? Do you think? Maybe
not this point, but I actually think.
I think we definitely have our eyes on it at the very least.
No, you know what I think happens?
Okay.
I think the Southern United States stands up and says we need to take Haiti. We cannot allow the Haitian Revolution to succeed.
Okay,
I would agree with that. Particularly if we have slavery.
Economic standpoint, I think so, because Napoleon chose Haiti over the Louisiana Territory because up until even well after the Haitian Revolution, it was essentially the economic breadbasket of colonial Caribbean.
The Louisiana purchase happened because of Haiti.
Yeah,
because he lost his main economic hold in the New World. He said, "You know what? I'm just gone. I'm just cutting everything out."
Yeah.
So I think
maybe they take Haiti as part of the settlement.
I actually think we take Hispaniola. We take Hispaniola.
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting thought. Because so here's the thing: the Haitian Revolution happened in our timeline from 1791 to 1804 roughly. I want to say.
Yeah.
So what you guys are suggesting is that Haiti is, rather than given independence, it's basically thrown in as part of a settlement with our war against the Spanish-French combined forces. Is that what you're saying?
That's
Okay.
kind of what I'm envisioning, because this is going to be the time when we're, we need a navy to enforce any of this. We don't have the Barbary Wars that would have gotten us a navy, but this is just actually a better reason for us to make a navy. So I think we may have an even, not a massive American navy, but a larger American navy than we had in the 1790s and 1800s in our timeline, because one, we have to have boats to ship everything to Prussia to do whatever material supplies we're going to do for the coalition, and also we have to we can't zombie walk across the bottom of the Caribbean to our new territories in Haiti.
We end up with a large. I'm gonna call it a green water navy.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's not
exactly
brown water, because it's not river. It's not just rivers and lakes, but it's the Gulf and the Caribbean is ours, and you're not going anywhere near it.
Yeah.
So
I think we have enough naval power to project that.
And I think the American, I'm going to call it the American Caribbean Empire,
There you go.
looks a little like the Baltics.
Yeah.
You have a group of, because this would be like recruiting basically Baltic Germans, Teutonic Germans to go rule over an oppressed population. You need to have an upper crust implanted into this Caribbean. The entire Haitian Revolution kind of took care of the French upper crust.
Well, and you've also got a history of, like, look at Alexander Hamilton. He was derided as an immigrant because he came from, don't ask me which island, but one of the Caribbean islands.
One of the West
Jamaica.
Indies.
He was from Jamaica. One of the West
Okay,
Indies.
it's
Or
Jamaica.
West
But
Indies.
so there's already at least some history of at least American commingling with the Caribbean, populace. So it's not that far of a stretch. I don't know that there's going to be like, Stahlhelms and jackboots, sort of real, like straight Prussian. I do think there's certainly going to be some of that, but I also think there's going to be some American, not entrepreneurial, because it's not really a great word yet for this time in history, but there's going to be kind of a German-American combination that goes down to the Caribbean, almost like, sort of a proto-corporate, Banana Republic situation. Like, I'm almost envisioning, an American West Indies company sort of situation, more political and less private, but that sort of resource extraction focus on the Caribbean for the continent. I don't know.
Now, the one thing I do want to add, and we didn't talk about it, and he's a young man right now, but John Quincy Adams famously said of another Caribbean island that if it was ever severed from Spain, it would fall naturally into the lap of the United States, that being Cuba.
Yeah,
I think we take both.
I don't take Cuba. I wonder if Cuba ends up being sort of I think Cuba might take its independence, and I say independence with heavy air quotes here, but I almost wonder, because Mexico is a very recently former Spanish territory at this point. They're still very close ties with Spain.
No, the Crive Dolores is, they're still Spain.
Oh, they are still Spain. Sorry.
The Dolores was like 1820s.
So I can see Cuba kind of getting rolled in, at least officially. Whether boots on the ground situation is the same is kind of a different story, but at least officially, I think Cuba would be kind of rolled into Spanish Mexico, at least in some sense. And I think that then becomes the sort of friction point between this new resurgent American kingdom and the empire of soon to be Mexico after this war. Because what
we're saying here is that we might see a Mexican-American war fomenting, but not over Texas per se, but over Cuba.
I don't. And the reason I say that is this. One, the Cuban social structure at this point is more similar to the American South than it is to anywhere else. If you look at what happened in the Mexican imperial period, I'm going to take a shot at you, Robert. Hope you don't mind. Why did Texas become a place? Because they loved their slaves so much.
That was a big part of it. That
The Empire of Mexico.
We wanted our thing, and we wanted to do it our way. And
Okay,
a strong central federal government in Mexico was a bad thing to us.
Because the economy of the rest of Mexico did not depend on plantation slavery.
Yeah.
The way that the rice.
It was planned to be for Texas, because it wasn't quite there by the time the Americans come in. But the part of East Texas that could be was
the climate
planned.
allowed for it and everything.
Yes.
Okay, so
I think what might happen, by the way, maybe we have. I just think Cuba is right there. If we've got Haiti, we're taking Cuba as well.
Yeah, and the more we talk about it, makes sense.
Looking at the European situation, like, what's Spain gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. I guess I push back on it just out of the sheer amount of territory that we're talking about acquiring. But if you look at the rest of the world at this time, that's not that unusual. So yeah, I think
the dynamics that we're setting up though in this timeline kind of lend itself to that.
Yeah, and
I think there's a good reason behind it.
It does, because you've got in my mind, if he comes over here, he doesn't sit back and be a do-nothing king. Von Steuben becomes very much a force to be reckoned with, more than he was even.
I think
so you have a much bigger Prussian military influence.
Oh, very much. I think the American military is much more on the Prussian model.
Von Steuben's the military governor.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, military governor of Cuba. That's not a bad place to put him, because
in this timeline, honestly, not.
No, I think he's military governor of Hispaniola.
Oh, yeah.
That's like trying to put this in kind of understandable terms. Hispaniola being both, the Dominican Republic and Haiti to us, is to this situation what Cuba was to the Spanish-American War. This is the hot spot. This is the dangerous spot. This is where you put your best. And Cuba is kind of like the Puerto Rico. It just happened to come along with it, but we're not really putting much attention on it.
So maybe von Steuben is in Hispaniola and somebody like Alexander Hamilton, because he's got colonial, an upbringing, so he's familiar with.
I would say Hamilton. Hamilton is if Hamilton is around and active.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Hamilton.
Ideal space for
that's
him to
kind
go
of
play.
Hamilton doesn't die in a duel to Aaron Burr, possibly, because they basically give him a way to.
Well, because there's no presidency for them to.
And there's no presidency for them to fight over, so Hamilton's still around.
Yeah, I think at least he's a mover and a shaker of some sort. I don't know that
I'm hesitant.
Okay.
About that, and here's why. I think Hamilton, in a weird way, is too northern.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking that.
You want somebody who's like, I'm going to say Francis Marion.
That's who I was thinking. Mel Gibson.
You want a Virginian or a South Carolinian down there.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll say Francis.
Yeah, that makes a lot. I was thinking Pinckney. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Pinckney would be good too. Yeah. So basically, we've got we'll say in the aftermath of the War of the First Coalition, right around the time that Napoleon, we'll say he, I guess, still beats the coalition just for the timeline's sake. Right around 1800, the U.S. has greatly expanded because they've taken all these territorial, areas from the French and the Spanish, but the continent still, at least kind of because of our limited, involvement, we're not going to do a whole lot to change the impact on that a whole lot. So, 1800s, you've got Napoleon and the consulate basically a thing. Napoleon is making his grabs to become the first consul. He's not the emperor yet. Then Henry I of America dies in 1802. So here now comes our big crux of the episode. Who then takes over? Because in the last episode, we decided this was a sort of an elective monarchy, kind of like a Holy Roman Empire plus whoever else you can randomly grab that might be interested in the job you put in the voting pool. So who do we think would be the next American king for the early 1800s. And for the sake of the discussion, I guess and if y'all don't agree with this, let me know. I'm imagining both a pool of sort of the most prominent American, not statesmen, but like governors of states and European monarchies, with, I think, a heavy emphasis on European houses because of what we just did for the last 10 years of, hey, we just started meddling in Europe's business.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's going to be much more of an emphasis on that, just because if we're this much more closely tied to Europe and European affairs, we're going to want to keep that more old school model going. And again, with the whole idea of, Washingtonianism, lack of European foreign presence and involvement, a desire to break away from that not being a thing. And us as a nation still being very, very young, I think that we're still going to want to have more of an emphasis on having European talent being brought in as opposed to homegrown American talent. I still think that probably in the long run, these, the founders and, that whole, gaggle of individuals are probably going to still be very prominent in like ambassadorships, governorships, those sorts of positions. And so over time, we would probably see the Holy Roman Emperor kingship pool, going more towards that direction. But I think in 1802, we're still going to have a huge emphasis on wanting the American king to be, maintaining those very close ties, especially with everything that's starting to blow up in Europe at this point.
Yeah, I think that's probably the way to go.
Yeah. So what monarchies do we have, or what eligible candidates do we have at this point?
Yeah, so I guess let's think about sort of, I guess, what the European situation is. So I think first off the bat, you've got the Regency period of England, not starting yet, but about to start. King George is about to go just off the deep end.
Throw that out right now. There's no way we're going back to.
No way we're going to grab someone from Britain.
The reason why I bring that up is this is also right after the Acts of Union. So Ireland has literally just within months of the time period we're talking about becoming the UK. So if anybody's going to be from the UK, I imagine it's going to be, some of the old Stuart line, or maybe some of the old leftover kings of Scotland. I think that's a long shot, but just in thinking sort of try to name who our pool is, I think that's maybe who we would be looking at. Germany?
I was going to say, or do you look in the German? We just had a Prussian, so we keep the Prussians around.
There's another.
He's not.
There's not necessarily a royal family, but I think, and you mentioned this earlier, Dylan, offline. Who's the American ambassador to the French court, the French nation at this point?
Yeah,
it is
Thomas Jefferson, because Henry's not going to want him around because he's still too pro Democratic Republican small government, so he sends him back to France.
And I think the interesting thing about Henry happening to die when he does is there's a lot going on in Europe right around then. This is actually after the episode where our timeline Napoleon goes and discovers the Bass Pro Shop in Egypt.
No.
I knew it was going to come at some point.
Stop it.
You knew it.
Stop right now.
He's getting revenge from my barbecue comments.
Well, you notice I said that we would need to have a governor of Cuba from Virginia or South Carolina.
Yeah.
Because the state in between.
Yep.
Yes, the gears are
turning. The
turning.
state in between was too busy inventing barbecue.
Yeah. I think whoever governs Cuba is going to have the claim to the barbecue on that one. But,
you know what? There is actually an argument that barbacoa comes from the Taino word. Yeah.
I think
so. Maybe it does need to be a North Carolinian.
I do think Jefferson's an interesting idea for the pool because he is an American, but he also has the boots on the ground experience in France to navigate whatever's going on. So you're not nominating Jefferson for the pool?
No, I am not. I think Jefferson wouldn't take it.
I do agree.
I would agree he wouldn't take it just because he's so opposed to this model of governance. I don't think he would take it.
But what I think is going on is this is Peace of Amiens. This is the end of the wars, the early wars between the French Revolution and the crowned heads of Europe. And this is probably at this point, Jefferson could still honestly look at Napoleon and see another George Washington and see a Cincinnatus-like figure who was military, who stepped up, who has Republican virtue on his side. This is kind of the point where that starts turning. And as famous as he was for doing this, I think there's an interesting possibility that the next American king is Joseph Bonaparte.
That actually,
because he was so famous for doing that to everywhere.
Yeah. So that's an interesting idea. I think his name might be in the mix, but at this point, Napoleon's not. I don't know that he'd be considered, sort of a monarchy because he's the first consul, but he's still doing the whole delusions of republicanism kind of deal.
This is where that switch happens.
Yes,
we're right about the point of him crowning himself emperor.
Yes, yeah,
and
like 2 years.
So it's a little believable.
So does Jefferson sells him basically?
I think Jefferson sells. I think, by the way, I believe that that's in Napoleon's head. He's already thinking.
Yeah, he's thinking about that. Yeah, and you can have Jefferson as sort of the chancellor.
I think
that's a possibility too.
The really interesting thing is that, and when we talked about Jefferson is going to realize who Napoleon is later, but I think it's a really interesting idea that Napoleon sells us Joseph. We bring in Joseph, we bring in Jefferson as a chancellor, and to see the constitutional interplay between those two forces as Jefferson and the Americans realize what Napoleon is. We're not necessarily tied to France, but I think it's an interesting constitutional question, and Jefferson coming, as we all think he would, realize what's going on with Napoleon and use that as a check and move to check the power of an American king.
Okay, that's an interesting. I think that's a good. I don't want to commit to that yet while we're still figuring out candidates, but I like that.
I'm liking that as a possibility. Yeah.
Just to get one out of the way, I think this is too much of a Protestant kingdom. I don't think the Habsburgs are going to be involved. I also think Americans are going to be disgusted by the chinniness of the Habsburgs. So we'll just say that they're out.
I mean, also keep in mind, Amiens is the end of the is when it becomes the Austrian Empire and is never again referred to as the Holy Roman. Yeah. They give that up. So they are, if you're an American, you always want to be picking somebody on the upslope.
Upswing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I have kind of an interesting, I don't have a specific person, but I have an interesting idea. And this more is for the interesting Western Hemisphere possibilities. So we're kind of right in the middle of the Napoleonic sort of kerfuffles.
Mm-hmm.
But in the second one, something very interesting happens with Brazil. The House of Bragança leaves Portugal and becomes the Empire of Brazil. So I don't have a specific person because I don't know the Portuguese royal family at this point super well. But do we think that because you also have to remember there's Americans looking southward to say, okay, we've got the Spanish down here, we've got the Portuguese down here. The French are kind of out, but we've still got these other two big dogs we've got to deal with. So Europe is not the only concern that the American kingdom has. They've also got to look on their sort of southern border. So do we think there's any chance? And I'm kind of opening this up to either Spanish or Portuguese sort of, desperate six sons. But do we think that's anywhere of consideration? Or do you think that the Americans are looking at Mexico with hungry eyes, so they're saying that's not where we want to go?
Not this turn.
Okay.
Not this iteration.
But maybe later.
I think that first, that hasn't happened yet. I do think, what is, by the way, fun trivia fact, what is the oldest standing alliance in Europe?
It's the treaty between England and Portugal.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So out of hand, I just said no English. The other thing is, I think let it play out a little bit. We're still talking the early 1800s. I think around the 1820s ish.
That might be more of a possibility.
When they are established as the Empire of Portugal. I think after the Bonaparte, that's an interesting argument, especially when you think about like Confederatos. And, we keep dancing around this issue of the expansion of plantation slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think, in the Confederatos were Confederates that left the United States for the Empire of Brazil to extend slavery or to continue having slaves.
Yeah, exactly.
And that lasted until 1889 on a legal basis, I want to say. A full almost
there's
30
still towns in Brazil that have like a Confederate Day festival. Like they fly the flag and everything.
So I think what we may be, first and foremost, give the Brazilian Empire a chance to start on its own thing.
Yeah. Then
nobody lives forever. So the third American king.
Okay, so the more we kind of circle around, I think Joseph Bonaparte is actually, I think that's.
Maybe really not even that one, but one of his brothers.
No, but basically, we'll just say him for the sake of convenience. So I guess any other last minute, before we, I guess, pick who it seems like.
I'm just gonna throw this in here from a quick set of Googling around, Wikipediaing around, trying to figure out what's going on at this time period. 1800s, European, affairs is something that I know, tangentially, and wish I knew, kind of more in depth. This is definitely something that inspires me to do that. But we've been talking a lot about like Brazil and Portugal here. And I was just reading up on the fact that in 1799, we have the Queen of Portugal, Queen Maria, basically kind of King George III on us. Yep. So we have Britain, we have Portugal, both kind of dealing with the same sort of problem, that their monarchs are going kind of crazy. So Maria's son in 1799, John VI, who ended up being the king formally, I think in 1816. He started kind of governing as a prince regent. So, Maria is technically still the head of state, but her son is really kind of running the show. So could perhaps, and I don't know that royal family very well, but could we see some sort of, Portuguese prince? And because Portugal at this time is basically trying to be as neutral as possible with everything that's going on, with the conflicts brewing in France, all of this. And so there's factions going on within Portugal. And Portugal is, like we just said, they're traditionally allied with Britain. So would we be able to get over our, we just got, a war of independence from these people. We don't really like, or want any sort of British, candidates. But could the Portuguese be possibly seen as a step removed, and they're trying to maintain neutrality at this point? I don't know if that really necessarily goes well with the tides and the vibes of where we as a Prussian, American kingdom essentially are going at this point. But I think maybe a Portuguese prince somewhere along the way could be thrown in as a candidate.
Yeah, I almost wonder, talking about that, I wonder if at this specific moment in time, just because we've just fought a war against the French, we're 10 years removed. I do think that Joseph Bonaparte presents a really good argument, especially for Americans that are removed by, an ocean from Europe. But I wonder if, so basically, I guess I'm trying to figure out who we set up as the sort of the other pole to Joseph Bonaparte's candidacy. And I'm almost wondering if we pick, and I do not have a name. I'm wondering if we pick one of the like random prince electors of the Holy Roman Empire on the the Lowlands coast, like how the British grabbed, the House of Orange, kind of sort of, something like that, where they're not going to be a direct Prussian, but they're going to be somebody who's more in sort of the Prussian-British coalition axis rather than the French, who are looking like, with Napoleon, the big scary dogs on the block. That, I think, becomes the sort of which one do you pick more? Chris, you look like you have thoughts.
Chris seems like he's bursting at the seams.
I don't know if this would work. I'm just going to say it anyway. A distant cousin of the current British monarchy, Albert of Saxe.
Coburg?
Yes.
Yes. Let's do it. Saxe-Coburg.
Let's go.
All right. So we've got the House of Saxe-Coburg pre-World War II, before they changed their name to Windsor, before they changed to even become kings of England.
Hey, yo.
Joseph Bonaparte. I like that. And Saxony is
I'm loving
Saxe-Coburg
this.
It's related enough to sort of Saxony and sort of the central German heart. Like there's going to be enough of a tie to.
Yeah, there's enough ties.
You know what? If it's distant enough to marry your cousin over there, it's distant enough for us to bring you in, right?
Yeah, this is America.
This is America.
Okay, so I guess those are our two main choices. So which one do we think is going to win? We've already heard the arguments, I think. I guess at this point, we'll just take a podcast vote and pray to God it doesn't end in a tie, or else the Pope's going to become king or something.
Mm.
Okay,
So
thoughts?
Jefferson is campaigning for Bonaparte, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
10 billion.
Joseph Bonaparte with Jefferson as like his sort of chancellor. Yep. So that's who you think, Robert?
Jefferson's basically his campaign manager at this point.
Because of Jefferson's influence.
Okay.
He brings the South.
Okay.
For sure with it.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, I'm honestly, I'm not really necessarily seeing a strong constituency for our man Albert. So I would probably have to say Bonaparte as well.
Okay, Chris.
Bonaparte.
Okay, I'm gonna just because I hate.
Don't want the unanimous decision.
Unopposed. Yeah. I'm gonna say Saxe-Coburg, but I think the Bonaparte is the more interesting discussion.
I think it's more fascinating. Yeah.
So okay, we've got an early 1800s American Bonapartist monarchy, which so basically just let's assume nothing really exciting happens for 2-3 years, and say we now have Napoleon, Emperor of France, and Joseph, King, maybe Emperor because he feels like upgrading the title. I don't know.
Because why not?
Of America. Because why not? I do think that also makes it easier to manage the acquisition of French territory in Louisiana. That gives an air of legitimacy about the whole thing. So
I like that a lot.
Around sort of the Peninsular War, what do we start looking at happening? Does America then switch to getting involved in a Bonaparte Spanish throne, or does Napoleon not even worry about that per se, as a puppet kingdom, because Joseph now is American? Does he just go straight for a territorial grab in Spain? Does he do something else? Does he, what happens, I guess, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars just overall, do we think? And we don't have to go super into it, just real, broad strokes.
I will just say before we dive into this, as a small little bit of trivia, in our timeline, Bonaparte actually ended up in America. Like, I just think that's kind of interesting.
They actually did invite him to be governor of Louisiana.
Yeah.
Kind of funny.
It's kind of funny. So anyway, just wanted to throw that side note here. I think there's even from our timeline a little bit air of legitimacy here to make this work.
Yeah, I do think the possibility of Napoleon just like hanging out in New Orleans or somewhere in America, if he still ends up getting overthrown, is just kind of a fun little side tangent we can go on. Because him like supervising a Mardi Gras parade is kind of just too absurd a mental image to not contemplate. So do we think Napoleon still does his sort of Napoleon thing and in the second coalition, or do we think that changes at all? Or do we think he wins the wars of the second coalition with American backing, or do we think America, even with Joseph, is still too far removed to really do anything more than say maybe a couple of battalions of American?
I mean, yeah, here's my question. I don't again, kind of speaking out of ignorance here, Chris can probably hop in and educate me on this, but was Joseph in our timeline like particularly? I don't want to say noteworthy, but was he particularly ambitious? Like, as far as I'm aware, I had barely heard of him before this podcast. So to me, I don't really think, just from the little I know and the little I've done quick Wikipediaing here, I don't think that Joseph has the same tendency for glory and conquer and all this kind of stuff that his brother does.
The other thing is, you're right. I agree with that. The other thing that I find interesting is this: we're looking at the founding of nationalism, and I think it's interesting to think about the Swedes. I promise this is going to make sense. The look on Dylan's face.
Let's dive in.
The current Swedish royal family are descendants of Count Bernadotte, who was one of Napoleon's marshals. And, you know, in Napoleon's zeal to put his friends and family on every single house he could find, that's how they became the Swedish royals. And after the Russian campaign, Bernadotte stabbed him in the back and joined, I want to say, the 6th or 7th coalition. I think maybe we're looking at a situation where Joseph, for the lack of a better phrase, goes native.
Oh, okay. So basically, he pulls a Bernadotte in some sense, and
he makes decisions in the best interest of his polity.
Yeah,
I can see that.
Yeah,
especially with a Jefferson, you know. Okay, I'm gonna get really people. I kind of want to do like some charts here so you can keep track of which one I'm talking about. But thinking about Bismarck talking to, I guess it was Henry's step nephew or something, about the crown from the gutter, that you didn't want to become the German king by having it given to you by a Congress, because if you do that, you owe your legitimacy to that Congress. So I think a Joseph Bonaparte, who got his crown because of a Jefferson campaign manager, I'm not going to say from the gutter, okay? I am going to say from Jefferson, is going to constantly have that in the back of his mind. And I think Jefferson is going to move in his natural direction of against a strong man executive, and Joseph is going to be okay with that. He's still going to be ruling in the interest of the United States and not getting America involved in his brother's.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that makes a ton of sense.
I think that keeps us from getting too far in the weeds of what happens in the coalitions too. So I guess that leaves us with.
So I'm not going to have a 7-part episode just myself talking.
You can.
Yeah.
If
it's not going to be an episode. It's
That's
just going to be my internal monologue. Chris after hours talking about the continental system, and
that's a good idea for a separate podcast. Chris after hours.
Yeah, honestly though,
like the old Walking Dead post-show, interviews that they used to do.
Let's do it.
Okay, so that keeps us kind of very much like our own 18, teens and 20s and 30s. A very I'm going to say introspective, but manifest destiny aside, introspective American foreign policy, at least Western Hemisphere focused. So we've got Joseph. Hold on, I'm looking to see when Joseph dies.
He dies in 1813, I believe.
Oh crap! Okay, so that brought us like.
Oh no, never mind. Sorry, that was the end of his reign of the King of Spain.
Oh yeah, no,
he actually dies in 1844.
He moved to New Jersey or something.
Yeah.
So he lives until 1844.
1844. Yeah. So we have a good chunk of time here.
A good chunk of time. Assuming we'll say Southern cooking maybe shortens that by like 5 to 10 years.
Well, I was going to
butter
say
and
like
grease and biscuits.
We always have. I mean that in just New Jersey. Somehow Joseph Bonaparte winds up buried under the Meadowlands Stadium. Hasn't even been built yet, but
Instead of Jimmy Hoffa jokes, we make Joseph Bonaparte jokes.
But here's you look, I mean, and you have seen so many, all jokes aside, except so many others. You see pictures of American presidents when they're elected and when they leave office 4 or 8 years later.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, the stresses of the office would definitely probably.
Yeah, like you know what?
Sure.
In this timeline, he is not Marshal of the Mardi Gras parade.
In this
He is Marshal of
he retires to New Jersey and dies in Italy. So like, yeah, we'll probably. I mean, we could say like what?
Like
late 1830s. Let's call it
something like that.
1838. Let's just say 1838.
Yeah, something like that.
Ooh,
So
you know what? 1836.
Oh yes.
So that
Yes,
that's where
there we go. That's about the right
So
time.
I guess this is kind of a good end point for the episode, which we're heading for a.
Wait. He's buried under the Alamo. Mic drop.
Oh, thank God.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so I guess that means I guess that means we're sort of ending this discussion with sort of the 1830s under Joseph Bonaparte, who is in ill health, looking off to the west, hearing vague Spanish noises and musket sounds, and that's where we're episode 3 of this God knows how many part series. This one might go all the way up to the Clinton administration. At this point, we keep finding weird stuff to do.
We keep finding new things, but that's what I love about this timeline that we're making.
So this is good because this will let us talk. You know, the 1830s and 1840s and 50s is a very fraught time in American politics, and we've brought up slavery this time.
Yeah, this is where, as Robert mentioned, we can talk about America's original sin in a lot more detail.
Yep.
And I think it's really important that we do have all of that Caribbean territory.
Oh,
that changes a lot.
That plays massively into this entire thing.
Okay, so I guess that to set the stage for next time, we're going to go back down south, as they say. Any big lasting final thoughts before we all adjourn until next time on this? Nothing. I do have a counterpoint of trivia to you, Chris, from earlier. You said the treaty between England and Portugal is the longest standing European treaty. Does anybody know what the longest standing American treaty is?
I'm just going to throw out, is that America and France?
No, it's not a country you would expect.
No,
it's very random.
I'm wondering if it's actually the United States and the Cherokee Nation.
No, but you're close. Well, you're close and sort of off Europe centric. It's not the Cherokee Nation. It is Eastern Hemisphere. It's the other side of the Atlantic. I'll give you that. Robert?
Probably.
America, Liberia? I don't know.
Oh,
no.
Close. It is America and Morocco. The treaty.
Oh, that's interesting.
Signed in 1792.
I was on the right continent.
I learned that from our sovereign citizens discussion way back when.
Fascinating.
It all comes together.
Just
a great all-seeing eye over the Bass Pro Pyramid knows
all. Okay, by the way, listeners, I think this episode kind of determined something for us. We are going to release the first episode of this. Then we have to release the Egyptian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we have to.
Because we have to.
This
is setting up the Bass Pro Shops arc.
Yeah. So future listeners, just to clear this up, this is Evan and Chris and I did a 3-episode marathon of the first episode of this and the Egyptian episode. We did the Egyptian episode first, then the first episode of this. 2 weeks later, we recorded this. So all of these references are going to make more sense like a month from now once all of this is released, but now you understand where our headspace is.
Yeah. We technically did the election of 1876 episode first, but that had nothing to do with the Bass Pro Shops arc. So that one gets thrown out whenever it gets thrown out.
You never know. 1876 might have been when Bass Pro was invented. We don't know. Anyway, Any final thoughts before we sign off, gentlemen? Thanks again for a wonderful Sunday evening discussion here.
Oh yes, quite spicy.
All right.
It's almost as spicy as certain barbecue.
That's a Texas thing. We don't do spicy barbecue around here.
You're a Californian. You think
definitely
barbecue is a hamburger. You have no right.
Shots fired. Shots fired.
Shots fired. I'll let that go now.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I guess with that, before we get any more off the rails at the end of this than we already have.
All right. We just talked about burying people under Meadowlands Stadium.
I did compare Joseph Bonaparte to Jimmy Hoffa. So, this is only.
No, it's like it's the branching paths of where Bonaparte ends up. We have him in New Jersey under a stadium or under the Alamo.
Or
you have to land him somewhere.
The real question is, do they cut him into pieces so that Bonaparte's parts end up in different places?
Where do his hemorrhoids wind up?
That's Napoleon, not Joseph.
That's Napoleon, yeah.
Well,
which is a whole different fork that I have cooking at some point. Anyway, good listeners,
if you want to get that reference, follow our Discord because we.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thanks for listening from all of us here at the podcast. Have a good night.
Wait. We have to do our tagline. If you see a fork in the road or you see a fork in time, what do?
You always take it.
All right. Later, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.